Well, hello for the ladies who have joined. Thank you so much for I would say to Mary that comfort to be. It's great to have the opportunity my knowledge and to share some of the experiences that I have had working with individuals who have experienced grief and loss in some capacity. So specifically today, in addition to looking at grief and loss as a whole and learning about some of the we transform grief and loss and the other side of it, person, if you will, and better or more positive human being. We're also going to chat a little bit of loss, an individual loss, such as a loss of a spouse, or whether it's the loss of some school, a factory closed down, with the loss of all related to, we come together as well as COVID. I mean, you can't turn on the news obviously now without hearing that 5-letter word. It definitely has played a role on our psyche over this last year or so. And so what can we do, minimally for ourselves to take care? And why is this important? And so I'm going to start there. It's important because, whether we are folks just working in the community and living in our communities, or whether we are people who work for organizations or agencies, nonprofit or otherwise, we are agents of change, if you will, who have the opportunity to touch lives one way or the other. And similar to, there's a out there on the internet of it's kind of that I thought my life would go, and the line goes straight up. It's like a trajectory with like an arrow going up, and then on the other side it says how my life actually is going, and then it's a similar little graphic with like this scribbly mess of yarn kind of thing. And that's exactly how grief work is that we want it to go one way, but unfortunately that's just not how it is. And so we should care, because this is something that if it hasn't already affected or impacted our lives, it certainly will at some point. So I mentioned on the top that we will review some of the principles as it pertains to grief, as it pertains to transforming grief and loss in our lives. Well, those 11 principles come from the book that you see on the screen. And the book was written and produced and all of the stuff from a Ms. Leisha Hubin out of the Miami area. And she has a slew of credentials. And I've met her in person. She is a life coach, and she has done so much work in the grief and loss community. But essentially, several years ago, I took a days-long seminar on how to facilitate this coursework. And so this is her information. Some of these principles, they come from her. And because I facilitate the grief support group through Upland Hills Hospice and through the hospital, and now have a podcast online through the hospital, this is what we talk about, these 11 principles. And so what I will be talking about today will come from these guiding principles. Certainly we won't have time to, of course, review all 11, but we will get through some of the primary ones. Is this good speed, volume, all that good stuff?
Yes, I'm hearing it all right. If anybody else that's in the session, they're saying yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, onward. All right, so we'll start with, what is loss? Is loss only related to the loss of life, and can something positive come from it? Well, as you can see, loss is defined as the real or perceived deprivation of something that is deemed meaningful. A loss can be death-related or non-death related. A loss experience is one in which a return to some aspect of life that we have cherished or value is no longer possible. And when we think about loss, we oftentimes will think about when in fact we have been experiencing loss of some type since the beginning of our livelihood, essentially. We think about loss typically, again, as we are ending our life, or when we are losing somebody related to a passing away. However, we are losing something every time we are ending a life stage, so moving from middle school to high school, or high school to college, from being single to getting married, having our children go off to college. I mean, each of these things are, possible. We're losing transition, and the whole transform loss and is really trying to flip it loss from the lens of what strengths do I have from getting through these losses prior to now? And did I do that before? It's the idea of I can do hard things, and I have done hard things, and I have gotten through difficult moments, and I have the capacity to do so. And so it is my goal as the facilitator of the grief support groups, of the bereavement coordinator for the hospital in Dodgeville, to help people understand that they have far more capacity than they think they do. And really to help them to understand that, when they can see that loss truly is related to, there is no really going back to the time prior to when that loss was experienced. And so if we are able to understand that and help others understand that, hopefully what comes next will be a bit more easy for them. It's important to note that, one cannot understand how others feel about a particular loss, whether it be related to death or, something with COVID or some of the other losses I've mentioned. But it is important that we respect and that we support one another based on what we have learned through our own experiences. So I've mentioned some of the common losses just a couple seconds ago. The assessment that you see on the screen right now, this comes directly from the Transformation of Grief and Loss of workbook that Ms. Hubin created for our series. And I found this to be really interesting when I first took her seminar all those years ago, because I was somebody in the crowd that I didn't speak a whole lot that day, because I honestly had never thought about loss in such a broad way. I mean, I really had only thought about it in older adulthood. And so when this was presented on this, black and white piece of paper in such a defining way, it was like, wow, I have experienced a lot of loss, or, loss is a lot more common than I thought it was. And so again, I really just show this to present to you all, if you are, if you work for nonprofits or working with individuals in the community, to help them realize that, again, they have gone through some difficult things, and they too can, continue to do so, particularly if it pertains to a loss. So we'll talk a little bit about grief. So of course, grief and loss are different. I mean, grief is really related to the emotions that come along with having lost someone or going through a loss of something. And so as you will see, there are, there's far more than 15 different types of grief that exist. Myself, as a social worker and as a bereavement coordinator and grief, professional, I have what I mostly see and what I have primarily worked with are the top 5 that you see on your screen. So the normal grief, anticipatory, delayed, complicated, and ambiguous. So anticipatory grief is kind of what you think it is. Somebody has a cancer diagnosis or some type of diagnosis where that illness is going to be prolonged of some sort. And so you're kind of in limbo, I mean, you definitely don't know from one day to another or 1 week to another, like, is this going to be the last time I see mom or dad? Or, are they plateauing today? And then everything from here on out is downhill, and so that's a really, I call it my own version of purgatory, because it's a really hard place to be in. And I personally have experienced it, and I'm sure, others have as well, of just, not knowing, and then you feel guilty because you don't want it to be the last time that you see your loved one, but you also don't want them suffering. The complicated grief is really more related to traumatic grief, or kind of this, layers of grief, if you will. So having several losses in a row, or a complicated grief could be something like someone experiences a job loss, and then perhaps they are going through a divorce, and then a parent dies. And so they have all of these negative things happening, and they don't necessarily have time in between to process each negative event to what, to really the extent that in which they should be processed for them to heal fully. So after a while, it just becomes, I'll refer back to kind of that ball of yarn on that first page of, how do you get untangled from all of that? And then that the last type of grief on that top row, ambiguous or disenfranchised. So typically that is more related to an honest, one that people don't want to acknowledge. So I would say like an unacknowledged grief. So the loss of a pet, the loss of a friend, perhaps a coworker, a neighbor, people in our lives, or things in our lives that like they're important to us, but to the outside world, they don't necessarily understand, well, why are we still struggling with that loss? Like it's not a huge deal to them. And for us to try to explain it, because they are on the outside looking in, it's frustrating and it's hurtful. So, so those are the top 5 that I typically will see and, attempt to kind of work through. Again, there is far more than just the 15, but just be aware that those are the most common. All right, so just diving in quickly into COVID-19 a little bit, and some of the grief and loss as it pertains to this past year. The title of this slide is "How much more can we afford to lose?" And again, I think that we turn on the news every single night, and this is what we're talking about in some way or another, good, bad, or otherwise. This is just the new reality. And so we've all experienced loss of some type as it pertains to this virus and as it pertains to this past year, some more than others, and so whether it's related to coping with that loss or helping others in our lives cope with the loss that they have experienced because of COVID-19, I think it's something that we need to definitely take into consideration. And I think that we're all building up a little bit of a resistance, almost kind of a callous to what is this new normal, and I don't think that we probably are so far away from the end of this, or from a place where we can see even the light at the end of the tunnel. This is just my opinion, so please don't take this to the word of anyone super important. But for anyone to be becoming insensitive or callous already, it would be unfair, I think, because people are still experiencing so much trauma and so much anxiety pertaining to this virus and to this pandemic, that we do need to recognize that there is so much that lies ahead. And so what I would want to say is that, as it pertains to this, we might be seeing a lot of signs of grief among our friends and neighbors and those of us and those in the community. And so the typical reaction to loss, and some signs to kind of look for, or to continue to look for, would be shock, numbness, of course, sadness or anger, of course, anxiety. Other signs when we're coping with grief in the light of a pandemic, those things include trouble focusing on a normal task, sleeping a lot more than normal, feelings of anger or irritability, headaches and upset stomach, fatigue and low energy, and then really just kind of being quickly triggered by something that maybe a year ago or 18 months ago you would otherwise have been, maybe like the sound of a truck with like a motor or a loud engine rather wouldn't have triggered you so easily. But now it's, it's something that's a bit more, you feel a bit more surprised. So those are things that I think that, again, I encourage you to, I'm sure that you already are, but sensitive to, but things to look for if there are people in your life who still need that attentiveness. All right, so the rest of the presentation today will be more looking at those at the principles related to transforming our grief and loss. And so again, I don't have all 11 listed, one, for the sake of time, but two, not all of those principles are created equally. And so the ones that have been the most meaningful to me as both a grief professional, but also as someone who has personally experienced loss, are the ones that I've chosen to focus on. For more information on any of these principles, of course, you can reach out to myself after today's presentation, or you can link to the podcast on Upland Hills website, which is, again, at the end of this presentation. So the first principle that we typically talk about is accepting loss. And so we talk about how acceptance is really a choice. And so as you can see, that we can choose to face what has happened to us as it pertains to a loss, or we can deny it, hide from it, or not deal with it. But when we hide, we are hiding from emotions. When we deny, we are denying ourselves to live fully in the present. And when we choose not to deal with something, we are also choosing not to deal with the big stuff in our lives. But we likely are missing out on the magic of the day-to-day details that make up a life. And I think that, and this is in my personal experience of facilitating grief support group through the hospital, as the facilitator, I have gotten some flack, for a better word, or for lack of a better word, from folks who are sitting there who have gone through a loss, for saying, acceptance is a choice. How do we find acceptance as it pertains to loss? And what I will say is that, the acceptance of a loss or acceptance of the death doesn't mean that you are left unscathed. Death of a loved one will change you forever, but how you deal with the grieving process will likely determine, your ability to move forward in life. And acceptance should not be confused with healing or recovering from a loss, since that would put an enormous amount of pressure on the person experiencing the grief. Acceptance is really the beginning of the real healing process. It is the point where recovery becomes about the person left behind and not about the person being mourned. I think that a lot of people, in the midst of their sorrow, cannot imagine accepting the loss of their loved ones, and that in doing so would inadvertently mean that the person wasn't meaningful to them, or that this pain and this sorrow isn't worth it. But the crux of acceptance is that the assumption that the person experiencing grief is now healed, that they are now whole, and that the feelings of loss are now gone forever. And that's just really not how grief works. Acceptance involves the recognition that your life is now somehow changed forever because of the loss of your loved one. You're not going to return to that person. You're not going to return to the person you were before that loss, and you are now changed. And so again, if you yourself are dealing with loss or grief because of a death or some other type of loss as it pertains to COVID or something else going on in your world, I want you to hear me that this isn't about, accept it and get over it. It is about, finding a way to finding that strength within yourself to understanding that acceptance means that you can accept that this is going to be hard, and that you want to heal, and you have to start someplace in doing so. So this next slide is really more about, I'm a big quotes person. When I'm really struggling with my own stuff, I take to Pinterest, or I take to other websites that, help me get through things. And I've actually used these not only on the podcast, but also in the grief support group. And these are a couple of my favorites that I really have found to be helpful. And in fact, the quote with the mountain, we always look at the mountain ahead of us. We forget that the mountains behind us were just as hard to climb. I include that oftentimes in a bereavement card to the folks that I work with who are on the hospice caseload, because for them, when they're standing at the face, at the beginning of the journey with their loved ones on hospice, it's so hard to imagine, what is this journey going to look like? But they've been through and they've done hard things in the past. So this might be the hardest, toughest mountain they've had to ever climb, but I want to assure them that they won't have to climb it alone. And I want to assure you all who are listening and who potentially are listening in the future, that you too are not alone. And I just want to say that, when we are going through something difficult, regardless as to how you get through it, you will get through it just as how you move through every other moment in life. And that is breath by breath. The next thing I want to talk about is living with your grief. So if you are someone out there who is struggling with grief, or you are, whether that is related to the loss of life or of a loved one, or if it is somebody, grief related to COVID-19, there are several strategies that we can focus on and look at so that we can live with our grief, but we can still live our day-to-day life. So when we let ourselves feel all of our emotions, well, what that really means is that we should be prepared to experience an array of emotions. They might be anger, fear, irritability, resentment, just to name a few. The actual scope of emotions that we experience is almost endless. And if not acknowledged and eventually worked through, these emotions can pull us down into, the quicksand of grief, each one like a weight attached to our ankles. Grief demands our emotions and our heartache to be adequately attended to, honored, and hopefully healed before we're able to move forward. And just like any, difficult situation in our lives, when we don't attend to our feelings, if we are somebody who, let's say, bottles our feelings up, or if we get really, really angry and we just go for a run, or we numb our pain out, and we're really not dealing with the root of why we're feeling a certain way. Again, that stuff has its way of coming back up. And so the same can be said about grief and, in dealing with those emotions that come along with it. The idea of strengthening your grief muscles is very similar to letting yourself feel all of your emotions, but strengthening your grief muscles is just really giving yourself credit for walking through the day, feeling those moments of sadness, acknowledging the fact that, today I feel like, absolute garbage, but I got out of bed, I brushed my hair, and I managed to make myself lunch. If that's all you got done today, despite the fact that maybe you just lost your parent a couple days ago, or, even if it was a pet, if you lost your job yesterday, it's something. And so the idea of strengthening your grief muscles is the idea of that you're just able to, I don't want to say congratulate yourself, but you're able to celebrate the small victories, even when things are hard. Scheduling grief time, this is typically for someone who has gone through the hard stuff already. So, if they are already in, let's say, month 1, 2, or 3 of that difficult grief, and but they're still feeling that sadness all the time, but they are eager to, they want to move forward. They don't want to be hit with grief in the middle of a meeting with their boss or what have you. Setting aside grief time is associating your grief with, let's say, a blanket that your mom quilt for you, or a quilt that your mom made for you, rather, or a teddy bear that maybe your sister gave you, and it was your sister who passed away. That grief time is special time that you set aside with an item, with like a tangible thing, and your grief time is meant to, with that item, with that memory, with that thing that reminds you of that person. And then let yourself feel all of the feelings. And then when that time is over, give yourself permission to move on with your day. And your grief time can be several times a day. It can be for a couple hours at night. There's no rule to it, but it's really just, making sure that if your goal is so that it doesn't hit you at different times, that grief time can be really important. And then finally, hanging on to love, making sure that, your default memory isn't always about the last, let's say, painful memory that you had about the person who passed away, changing that default picture from the person who passed away to maybe that picture that the last happy memory that you had with them, or if the favorite memory you had was you were on a cruise with them or vacation or you were hiking, you can always change that default memory. And so just hanging on to those precious memories and those precious pictures in your mind versus, the last time you saw mom or dad, let's say in the hospital bed. Going deeper into spirituality, that is another principle as it pertains to transforming grief and loss. Again, I spent a lot of time on the podcast talking about this particular principle, but essentially spirituality, it's different for everybody and what that actually means. But we talk a lot about self-love, gratitude, and forgiveness when we talk about spirituality. And forgiveness really, to me, it's something that's so interesting, and there's so many studies and a lot of research being done on forgiveness, actually. And a lot of it actually is being done at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. But the idea of forgiveness of, when someone passes away, things often are left unsaid, or on both parties, on both sides of things. And so how do we find a way to live with that when it's too late to say those words? And so I would definitely encourage you to, listen to that podcast if that is something that you are more interested in. But it's really one of my favorite principles, but it's one of them that is really, it's so in depth that we really could spend the entire time talking about that one. Expressing our feelings. So of course, this is one, I've talked about emotions quite a bit so far today in our presentation. And so one of the things that Ms. Hubin says is, if you are wearing a mask, you risk losing connection with yourself. And I think that is so entirely true. I think that, when talking about our emotions, and I say this during the podcast, during one of the series, is that when I think about the mask wearing, I think about those commercials for medications, the woman walking around with like the cardboard mask, and then at the end of the commercial, whichever medication she's taking, there's effectiveness. And so she can put that mask in her purse or put it back in the closet. And then, she just goes on her way. But in real life, of course, that's not really how things work. We don't have that cardboard, mask with a smiley face on it that we can just, pretend all the time. And so the idea behind this principle is really just taking an inventory of how you're feeling and acknowledging that. And oftentimes we don't necessarily know how we feel because we aren't entirely sure, outside of 4 or 5 or 6 emotions, what we're actually feeling. And so I've included a feelings wheel PowerPoint for you. And if you just Google feelings wheel, dozens and dozens of examples will come up, and you might find one out there that would be more advantageous for you or for your purposes. But this one I really like. The color scheme is really good, but I think that when we can identify how we're specifically feeling, we are able to actually do more than just react. If I'm feeling, I'll give you a quick example. Now, and I'll just say this, I love my husband very, very much, but oftentimes he will say, "You're so angry." And he'll say it sometimes in a joking way and sometimes, in a not so joking way. And I'll be like, "No, whatever." So we'll have this little repartee between us, and haha, sometimes it's funny and sometimes it's not. But, after a couple of years, I think I've said to him, I said, "Sean, there's more emotions that I feel than just anger, And I said to him that, I'm not feeling angry. I'm feeling frustrated, or I'm feeling disappointed. Those things are, when we can identify the exact thing, we have so much more that we can go so much further with a conversation, because we can pinpoint exactly what we're feeling and then do something about that, versus just kind of throw a blanket over it and never really understand, why was I feeling a certain way, and what can we do about it in the future to avoid that pitfall again. Sharing with others, another principle as pertains to transforming grief and loss. I know that sharing with others is so difficult sometimes, particularly when it comes to our emotions. Sometimes it's easier to build a moat around us versus, swimming off the island. We want to do things by ourselves, or we feel like we are alone, even though we probably aren't. And so, I want to just point out that it is you and I, and not us versus them, and trying to identify who are the people that you feel connected with and what makes you feel connected. What are those things in life that bring you back to you? And I think that a lot of times, myself included, over the years, I've had to really think to myself, what do I still do that I enjoy, that brings me back to myself, that makes me want to connect with other people? And who are the core people in my life that when something's going really, really wrong, or if I'm feeling really sad or really lonely, who can I call on? I think that as we get older, we get busier with, whether it's with our kids or with the school or with community organizations or our job, or just life happens, COVID happens. Things happen. And so we do become more disconnected over time. And so take an inventory of the people that you could reach out to tonight or tomorrow and say, hey, we haven't talked in a really long time. Like, it would be wonderful to see you. And just to kind of rebuild that web of connection, because it more often than not, they probably are thinking the same thing, and they probably would love to hear from you as well. Taking care of yourself, so much easier said than done. I know we're kind of getting super low on time, which makes me sad, because there's so much more I want to talk about. But just taking care of yourself, of course, setting aside time for your grief and for your sadness if needed, making sure that you're taking care of yourself, sleeping, eating, getting some movement every day, even if that's just like walking outside in the sunshine for a moment. Finding you again, I've talked about that. And then if you like to track your day, really just like setting up a schedule for yourself, to kind of like, for the idea of like looking back to say like, oh, I felt crummy on Monday at 5:00. Oh, I also felt crummy on Wednesday at 5. What's going on at 5:00 every day? Why am I feeling this way? When you track your day, you can kind of get to the root as to why you might be feeling a certain thing at a certain time. Modifying your thoughts and living in the present. Those things are two principles that are really wonderful as well. Modifying your thoughts is really more about reframing. So the idea of reframing is just taking something and using your thoughts and finding a way to not necessarily turning them into something that's more positive, but giving yourself options for like how can you change that into something that doesn't seem so negative, which I know sounds kind of counterintuitive and perhaps the same thing. But the example that I will give you is that a gentleman, and this was in my support group a couple of years ago, but he said that he had tunnel vision in his marriage. I mean, he was divorced by this point, and he was so irritated with his then wife because she wasn't providing him with enough attention, with enough love. They ended up getting divorced after many, many years. And later on, after a lot of therapy, he had realized that it was him who had ruined their marriage, because he thought that the love was all up to her, that instead of him loving her to receive love, that love was within him, and love is a verb. That feeling is a result of his actions. And so he used that pain from realizing that, from losing that love, to rethink how he thought about his marriage. So there's a lot of information about reframing. I'm so sorry I'm moving through this so quickly. I'm getting tangled up a little bit. But the other thing I just want to mention is living in the present. If you're ever feeling, getting fumbled, like I'm getting fumbled, you can use grounding exercises. You can use breathing exercises. I really like grounding exercises because it gives your mind a chance to catch up with your words or with your breath. So the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise is simply just, what are 5 things that I see? What are 4 things that I'm hearing? What are 3 things that I'm smelling? 2 things that I can touch, and 1 thing that I am listening to. So really just looking at your senses, and that helps bring you back to the present moment, which is the entire point of doing any of the grounding exercises or any of the breathing exercises. And then, since we're talking about living in the present, one of my favorite quotes is, we do not heal the past by dwelling there. We heal the past by living fully in the present, which I find to be so incredibly true. Rebuilding your world and visualizing the life that you want. Those are principles that I could talk all day about. But essentially, how are your thoughts, and healing and renewal are more about what control do we have over how our thoughts are, and what can we contribute to our own healing and to our own renewal. And so I would have actually gone over a couple meditations and a couple of visualizations in this section had it been for some time. But again, I think that we can certainly talk outside of this if you are interested. But the whole point of this principle is helping people understand that they have so much control over their thoughts, when oftentimes we think that once the train has left the station and it's derailed, that we have no power over that, after that point, when that simply isn't true. We talk a little bit about guided meditations and visualizations. This visualization, or rather, is really one of the greatest out there. And I will read it because I know we have a couple minutes left, but I think it is really, really wonderful about what we carry with us, despite the fact that, it might have happened a month ago or a year ago or what have you. But as you can see, it says, 2 monks were walking down by the river when they saw a woman waiting to cross. She was in a dress, and it was obvious she didn't want to get her dress wet. The older monk, without saying a word, picked up the woman and carried her to the other side and put her down. The 2 monks went on their way in complete silence. About an hour later, the young man threw out a series of judgments to his older counterpart. How could you have touched a woman? We took a vow to never touch a woman, and you didn't even seem to care to contemplate it. The older monk listened to everything the other said and simply replied, Brother, I put her down an hour ago. Why are you still carrying her? When I first read that, I was at a loss for words. I thought that was so poignant and so true about so many things in our day-to-day life, about what we carry with us at home, at night, what we bring from work, what we take to work the next day. And how simply with tools and with enough training and with the techniques, how we could easily just put something down and leave it until the next time, so that we could fully live in the moment, with family, when we are where we're supposed to be physically and mentally. And then to end with just a couple more quotes that are really meaningful to me. The top one I really enjoy, I really like, because grief, like a lot of things, do ebb and flow. I mean, it comes and goes, and we just have to learn kind of how to deal with it and, go with it. And then the bottom one, the real question is not whether there is life after death. The real question is whether we are alive before death, which, I can't tell you how much that means to me. Those words are so poignant to me, because it really, even myself as somebody who's not even technically midlife, it really questions, wow, what am I doing now to make sure that I am alive, even in these hard times? so that I can really live fully without regrets and enjoy these moments that we do call living. So references, I wanted to give you a link to the Principles of Transformation page. I talked a little bit about understanding grief in the age of COVID-19. And then I have sent you a direct link to our the Inspire Health, the podcast page on the Upland Hills Health hospital page. So I really appreciate your time out there today. I know, gosh, it went really, really quick. And so if there's quickly any questions, I would love to hear from them. But otherwise, thank you so much. You can contact me via email, or those are the second phone number is my cell phone number, which would be the better way to call me. I can't receive text on that number as it's a work cell phone, but it would be wonderful to hear from you. If you would like any of these handouts or you want the PowerPoint via email, that would be fine as well.
Thank you, Shannon. I don't see any questions yet in the chat, but saying great job. Comments.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. And for those participating, thank you for your time. And again, I apologize for moving so quickly. I like this area a lot, and it's hard for me to be succinct with so much of this. So.
All right. A lot of positive thank yous, and thank you for everything. So thank you, Shannon.
All right. Great. Thank you, Mary, for your help. I really do appreciate it.